tear. It leads to the supercomputer. Class 12. Normal pulse, above average volatility.
You Guardians certainly know your tears, don't you?
That's the idea.
Yep, and I'm certain that anyone in your current demographic of preteen viewers will completely understand everything you just said. Was this an attempt at having some Star Trek-esque technobabble, or did you actually expect first-time viewers to comprehend that? Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Mainframe, the Reboot Retrospective, Season 1. I live outside the net. Going through people, places, and shows. To this place, Mainframe, my favorite place to be. My format? I have no format. I am a user, creating things on the web. Reboot! Before we begin, I'd like to explain what's going on. For those of you who have been on my channel for some time now, you may have seen or remember that I would occasionally do a video for a Facebook game called Marvel Avengers Alliance. Unlike my Let's Plays, these videos were heavily scripted, edited, and overall were more of a review than just some regular gameplay. When the game was shut down, well, so were the videos. I found, though, that I've missed doing these videos and writing scripts to present something entertaining, even if I was pretty bad about doing these constantly. I'm going to be starting that up again, hopefully with a bit of a better schedule, and starting with this first episode of a retrospective on one of my favorite television shows of all time, Reboot. If you're at all a fan of Linkara's History of Power Rangers, you should pretty much know what you're getting into here. With all that said, let's get on with the review. We start the series not with the beginning of the first episode, but with the actual opening credits to Reboot. In it, we hear Bob, the main hero of the series, describe that he travels through the internet and now defends a computer known as Mainframe, aiding the peaceful programs that live there and fighting off against any of the aggressive ones. While using the title theme as exposition is nothing entirely new, even back in the day of this show, Reboot uses it not only to give its viewers a small taste what they're going to get into, but also explains some of the basic premise behind the show. They even give a mystery that entices viewers to come back to see the answer, which is kind of funny considering we actually never do get a proper resolution to Bob's statement of he'll find out why the users are sending down games. Why are games so dangerous? We'll come back to that in a bit. Going into the first episode, The Tearing, we find Bob being chased by the twin robots Hack and Slash, who prove themselves quickly to be rather inept villains, and will continue to do so for a good long while. It's quickly revealed that they are little more than henchmen to a rather suave villain, whom we are introduced in the opening. We aren't given a name or any backstory to the character, other than he wants a favor from Bob, and gives a warning that not doing so will cause issues further down the line. After getting a small peek into Bob's home life, showing just how different this world can be compared to ours, we get introduced to the other long-standing characters of the show. Dot Matrix, her little brother Enzo, and Enzo's pet/canine companion Frisket in a diner that's clearly seen better days. The villain from earlier, now named here as Megabyte, had his minions trash the place after Bob refused to help him. This makes the Guardian rethink his initial decision, but Dot says that they should always say no to virals like Megabyte, while stating that mainframers stick together, with the entire diner sans minor character Cecil agreeing with her. It should also be noted that the vast majority of the background characters of this series are binomes, which are mostly consisting of living ones and zeros, while the other main characters are called sprites and tend to be a bit more humanoid. Megabyte takes this time to make a reappearance, showing up to offer Bob another chance at doing his favor, with the implication that the diner will be destroyed again should he refuse. Bob states that he won't move to make sure that this doesn't happen again, but the plan is ruined by one of the major aspects of living in the computer.
Warning, incoming game. Warning, incoming game.
Despite trying his best to get into the game, Bob gets barred by Megabyte and his cronies, forced to watch as the cube that houses it lands. We find out the real consequences of this once the game actually ends, with the user winning, the entire space that the cube had taken up being destroyed, or nullified as the main cast puts it. Naturally upset, Bob appears to be ready to take the virus head on, and is only cut off by Dot suggesting to meet with the head of the system, Fong. After beating Fong in a game, apparently the only way to get knowledge from him, the old sprite suggests to stay away from Megabyte, detailing how the virus has avoided being erased by Mainframe's upgrade systems, and that he has henchmen in nearly every sector of the computer. He gives Bob the old proverb of having your friends close and your enemies closer, before repeating what Dot said earlier in Mainframe or Stick Together. It's with this information that Bob leaves Fong's and heads right to Megabyte's main base, the Tor, alone. After a small segue in which Dot and Enzo learn just where Bob went, we get to really see the insides of Megabyte's base, as well as a small selection of his henchmen that clearly number into the thousands. It turns out that deep underground, Megabyte has been housing a tear, a normally destructive force of energy that can be turned into portals through the use of guardians like Bob, or the game sent down by the user. And since Megabyte has no control where the game cubes land within Mainframe, it's far easier to rely on the resident hero to get what he wants, a portal to the supercomputer. Knowing that Megabyte is, well, a virus and will infect the supercomputer if given half the chance, Bob once again refuses, only for Megabyte to turn aggressive, using a contraption of some kind to throw Bob into the tear. It turns out that going through a tear while it's not been stabilized into a portal will result in destruction, with them using terms such as erase and delete because, well, this is a kid's show where everything takes place in a computer. Bob saves himself by using his Guardian Key tool, known as Glitch, to transform the tear into a portal at the last possible moment, but closes it right after he's pulled free. All this means to Megabyte is that he'll have to join the Guardian through the tear at the same time to ensure that he has his portal to the supercomputer. This is where Dot comes in, having been captured by Hack and Slash, apparently because of a riot she had started outside of Megabyte's lair. Megabyte points out that such things shouldn't even be bothering them in the first place, even bringing up an image on one of the windows to show all of 3 binomes that had joined in on the riot. Apparently, though, this is also the same console that holds the tear in place, as a single kick from Bob knocks it over and powers down the barriers, causing chaos for the villains and allowing Bob and Dot to escape as the tear goes wild. Megabyte catches up with the fleeing heroes, showing that even when behind, the virus is not someone to take lightly, and is about to take matters into his own hands when another GameCube starts to fall, this time right on the Tor, negating the need for Megabyte's use for Bob in the first place. It's here that we get our first real exposure to GameCubes, which I personally think is one of the best concepts the show has to offer, especially from a framing narrative. It lets the characters interact and experience things that would normally not be allowed within their setting, while also making sense from a viewer perspective since, of course, most kids will have played games on their computers, or at the very least heard about them. We also get to see the show's namesake in action here, as Bob, Dot, and a bunch of binomes touch their icons, gaining spiffy new outfits. While never properly explained until much later, this is actually the core way for anyone who's caught in a GameCube to fight against the user, downloading information from the game into themselves, so as to gain weapons and abilities to help them survive. Remember, a lost game here means destruction for the sector that the cube landed in, along with anyone inside it. This particular game takes place in a space shooter, and immediately things turn out for the worse, as Megabyte shows off his viral powers of infection, allowing him to take control over the user. Knowing that the virus will immediately head to the tear, with the cube having turned it into a portal now, Bob and Dot chase after him in their own ships with the binomes in tow. It then turns into a race between the two factions, going through asteroids, enemy spacecrafts, and finally the surface of a nearby frozen planet. At the end, it's only Bob, Dot, and Megabyte in the final cave with the portal, the virus even able to destroy our hero's ships in the process. It's only because of Bob's use of glitch that he's able to enter the portal and end the game, returning it back into a tear and leaving Dot alone with a now furious Megabyte. Right as the virus is about to attack, though, Bob returns and uses something he picked up from the armory of the supercomputer to remove the portal completely, also making himself and Dot vanish. Megabyte runs off to try to find them, thinking they used a return command to go back to the diner, when Bob had actually used a hidden file command to render them invisible. We cut back to the diner shortly afterwards, Enzo explaining that Megabyte and his henchmen left after being unable to find Bob, Dot pointing out that because of this, Bob has made a guaranteed enemy out of the virus, while the Guardian states he wouldn't have it any other way, with the episode ending on a pullout to show the diner in near ruins. As a first episode of the series, the tearing actually has a lot of good qualities. It gives us a nice introduction to all the core characters that we'll be seeing throughout the show, introduces a few of the side ones, and gives us a core understanding of some of the basic rules about the world, mostly pertaining to the GameCubes and the roles of the characters. The first episode also goes to show that the series doesn't take itself as the most serious thing ever, and while it can and will get into darker subjects later on, there will always be an element of humor or some kind of joke that can be found. There are a few faults in this first episode, though, as we're kinda just plopped into the world without any real explanation of what's going on. While we can take a guess on who's the hero and who's the villain just through the voice acting and action of the characters alone, things like what glitch is, the tears, and why the main characters are the only human figures that we see throughout the series are left largely unexplained. Also keep in mind that this is 1994 when the show came out, so computer terminology isn't something that I think every kid will be well versed in at the time. For the first season of Reboot, the series is actually largely episodic, which means that the episodes are going to be connecting very little to each other outside of the main cast. You could easily show episodes out of order, and there would be very little that you would miss, barring the introductions of a few characters here and there. This is why I'm not going to be going into every single episode for this retrospective, if only because there's no need to when they don't really add anything to the overall series. In fact, there's only two reasons I'm actually going to be mentioning the Quick and the Fed here. One, it's because it's got one of my favorite running gags in the entire series, thanks to minor characters that were introduced in this episode, Al and his waiter.
And Al back there only runs at 3 decades. What?
But also because I can't talk about Reboot at all without also talking about the broadcasting standards and practices. You see, nearly everything on television has to deal with a group of censors whose job is, to quote the Wikia page about them, be responsible for the moral, ethical, and legal implications of the program that the network airs. In layman's terms, this means if they find something that they believe would be objectionable or would land them in legal trouble, the Broadcasting Standards and Practices has the ability to force a show to change or even deny an episode from ever being created in the first place. The 90s is where these guys really had a stranglehold on a lot of television, with some of the rules they had given out to what the creators could and couldn't do were obstructive at best and downright nonsensical at the worst. It's here we actually see the first real instance of it in this show, from a story perspective, as instead of being able to smash through a window to get into a castle, Bob instead has to use glitch to warp the glass around him, returning it to normal after he's through. This is actually mostly done to prevent kids from thinking they could run through windows as well, and while this particular instance of censorship makes sense, you can just see how crazy it will get later on once we get there. We learn a bit more about the world of Mainframe as we get into the episode called the Medusa bug. Not only does it and the following episode, The Tiff, really hammer in Dot's workaholic attitude and lifestyle, but it also shows Megabyte's willingness to do just about anything when it comes to getting ahead in the system. In this particular case, it means double-crossing the only other virus that happens to live within Mainframe, Hexadecimal, the Queen of Chaos. Though Hexadecimal is actually introduced in the second episode of the series, this is the first real episode that centers around her. An over-the-top character at first glance, Hex shows just how much of a threat she can be using her own viral powers, throwing balls of energy and being able to fly. She also has control over nulls, small slug-like creatures that are a direct result of what happens to anyone who ends up losing a game. Hexadecimal also turns out to be pretty dang devious in her own right, knowing that Megabyte would do anything to get more power and control, and using that greed to trick him into obtaining a viral infection known as the Medusa. The bug turns him into stone and quickly runs throughout his entire base, eventually working into Mainframe itself. This is also the episode that establishes two major aspects of the show that will be a constant thing to keep in the back of your mind. The first is actually Mainframe's level of technology, as seen by Fong's confusion when Bob starts sprouting off different programs to try and fight the Medusa. This makes the old sprite point out, not for the last time, that they are not the supercomputer, and don't have all the bells and whistles that Bob is used to. The other major aspect that we learn is that Bob, being a Guardian, is apparently immune to being infected by the Medusa and other viruses. It's actually this aspect of our hero that saves the day, as it allows him to talk to the she-virus, making her reverse the bug once it's made clear how plain, quiet, and boring things will be now that everything's been turned to stone. After all, why would something that embodies chaos want everything to remain frozen in time? With a few more episodes that continue fleshing out our characters, we actually get our first real bit of continuity in the show with the Crimson Binome. Not only will Captain Capacitor here become a reoccurring character in the later seasons, voiced by Dr. Robotnik himself, Long John Baldry.
Vanished! Destroyed! Obliterated! Look alive, me hearties! We're behind schedule!
But we also hear Bob mention of a friend, a woman named Mouse with a long story. All that we really know about her for now, though, is that she has some kind of skills that allow the Guardians to pull off a Looney Tunes trick to escape the software pirates. We also get to see Dot come a bit more into her own, and she proves that just because Bob's the main hero, it doesn't mean that she can't get into the action when needed, using her knowledge of profits not only to impress the captain, but also convince him to go in business with her. Wizard, Warriors, and a word from our sponsors is actually mostly a fluff episode, not having any real impact on the overall story or plot of the show, but I mention it for three reasons. The first is because nearly the entire episode takes place inside a GameCube, showing that there are just some games that can't be completed by our heroes in a few minutes, or by completely destroying the users. The second reason I bring up this episode is because this is actually another instance of the censors meddling with the show again, forcing the animators to place clown heads on the tip of the arrows to make them less lethal. Finally, this is the first episode where one of my favorite minor characters is actually given a leading role alongside the rest of the cast. Of course, I'm talking about everyone's favorite appliance,
Mike the TV! Mike!
It's in the following episode that we're really able to see just how far Megabyte is willing to go in his attempt to gain access to the supercomputer. Not only does the virus hire someone from outside of Mainframe to help him out, but he's also willing to send his minions into someone else's mind via a shrink ray to try and gain control over them and their secrets. Oh, and that person that Megabyte hired? It's revealed to be the previously mentioned Mouse, a computer hacker and a mercenary who will work for most anyone if the pay is right. Had everything gone to plan, Megabyte would have succeeded in taking over Bob and getting into the supercomputer, but a thirsty Enzo ends up consuming Mouse, Hack, and Slash instead. Without the codes to the supercomputer, the virus goes for the next best thing, Mainframe's central core. It's only by Bob shrinking himself and going in after the henchman that he's even able to do anything. Turns out, though, that Mouse and Bob are actually on pretty friendly terms, despite him having arrested her for trying to hack into the supercomputer. And when he brings up what's happening outside, Mouse confronts the virus for the truth, resulting in one of my favorite scenes from Megabyte in the entire series.
Really, Mouse, I'm surprised you doubt my loyalty. After all we've been through, who would you believe more? Bob or me?
That's it. I'm pulling the plug.
The episode ends with our heroes escaping Enzo's brain, the rest of the cast being introduced to Mouse before the hacker makes her escape. I would also like to bring up that this is actually the last episode that we get to hear Jesse Moss as the voice actor for Enzo. Unlike a lot of other voice actors for young boy characters at the time, the people behind Reboot actually hired a kid to play the part of Enzo. It turned out, though, that Jesse was approaching that point where he could no longer sound like the kid he was supposed to be, and thus was replaced by a Matthew Sinclair for the rest of Season 1 and the entirety of Season 2. Following that adventure, we get into the episode Talent Night, known for having one of the biggest changes in the entire series thanks to the censors. You see, in the original script of the show, Bob, Dot, and the other minor characters are throwing Enzo a birthday party, with the ending sequence being a musical number by Dot in which she kisses her little brother on the cheek. And this is what the censors had a problem with, demanding that it be removed from the show on the basis that they believe it promoted incest. I am not even kidding here. Ian Pearson, one of the show's creators, described the reasoning as one of the sickest things he had ever heard. This led to this particular episode being filled with many jokes, either directed at the censors or at their expense, including a full parody of the YMCA celebrating the non-violent way. But it also gets one of the crowning moments of awesome as the entire thing ends off with a battle of music and guitars between Megabyte and Bob. Before we move on, there's one major rule I'd like to bring up that the censors had for the show's creators. They couldn't do a cliffhanger episode because they didn't want the children in the audience to have traumatic tension. It's with this knowledge that I'm wondering how in the world the creators were able to get around that rule as we get into the season finale two-parter, Identity Crisis. Starting off fairly normal for a reboot episode, we find Bob and Enzo in an older GameCube, with the Guardian using it to help teach the young sprite to take things like this seriously. He even warns of an extremely dangerous game simply known as the Funhouse, which Enzo waves off as being an old story to scare little sprites. After defeating the user, the pair heads off to the diner, talking about Dot's big day. And this is where the episode starts to take a rather dark turn, with Dot experiencing a weird vision that replaces Cecil with a blank screen version of himself that also comes equipped with claws, and turning all the binomes into viral versions of themselves. She simply brushes it off as a side effect of working too hard before she and Bob leave. This is where we really start feeling the change in atmosphere from the rest of Season 1, with darker colors and deeper music being the norm, while the slapstick and the jokes that have been our bread and butter since the beginning of the series is almost entirely absent. That, and the situation that our heroes are in, really hammer to us that there's something serious going on, with Bob and Dot trying to convert an entire sector, freeing the citizens there from Megabyte's control. To do this, the binomes must submit their personal ID codes and register them with the principal office, something that's not lightly done considering their personal IDs are all that they have left to them. We're introduced to a binome who actually remains nameless for the majority of the episode, with all that we really know about him is that he's one of the major driving forces in convincing the entire sector to give up their PIDs, and is the one that helps Bob and Dot escape when Megabyte crashes the party. The trio gets chased throughout the sewers when the virus comments that he's grown tired of all of Dot's attempts to take control from him, and that it's time to break the woman's spirit once and for all. Our heroes eventually escape, though at the cost of the binome that was helping them, and the two commandeer one of Megabyte's own tank-like vehicles to get as far from the sector as possible. Though along the way, Dot experiences yet another odd vision. After stopping to clear her head, Megabyte brings up several vid windows, announcing to the citizens that their struggle for independence was over. The virus then claims that Dot delivered the PIDs to him. Dot double checks, only to find that the file that had them has been removed completely from her organizer. Of course, Megabyte is lying, currently working on hacking the file open so he can turn every binome in the sector viral. How he got the file becomes clear, as the binome from before is revealed to be the culprit, now named here as Cyrus. Regardless, this does exactly what Megabyte wanted it to do, with Dot now having lost almost all of her drive thanks to losing the PIDs. Things only get worse as the episode ends with a GameCube landing on our heroes, revealing that it holds the Funhouse. Knowing how much danger they're in, Bob immediately reboots and has to encourage Dot to do the same, showing that she's so broken from the events of the first half of the finale that she didn't even want to bother fighting the user, even if this would result in her eventual deletion. She's eventually convinced, only just narrowly escaping an exploding pie by the user. Following the demonic clown, it's quickly revealed why the Funhouse is so feared. Random chance. And this makes sense too when you really think about it. Nearly all other games that we've seen up to this point have either been combat or skill-based in some fashion. So having a game where a single choice can result in an instant loss would have been a great threat to anyone in Mainframe. Bob himself ends up choosing the wrong door, being forcibly removed from Dot and nearly the rest of the episode, saying it's up to her to win the game and save their lives. Of course, she's still blaming herself from before, and thus is ready to give up on the game entirely. This is where Fong appears in the game, telling her that he wishes to show her something before placing 2 odd discs against her temples. We then see an odd alteration in the game around Dot, with a simple sound of "Game over, user wins," repeating in a slower and deeper tone, eventually fading to black. When we're able to see anything again, all that's left is a darkened sky and a huge crater where the sector once stood, signaling a lost game. Somehow, Dot finds herself crawling out, still alive. Trying to get her bearings, she eventually finds her way to the diner, only to discover that her earlier visions from before have come true, with nothing but viral binomes there and Cecil replaced with the faceless screen. It's here that she learns that Mainframe is a thing of the past, having been replaced with Megaframe, led of course by Megabyte himself. We're then introduced again to Enzo, older and now acting like a brutish thug instead of the kid he once was. He doesn't believe Dot when she claims to be his sister, saying that she blew it in a GameCube and got herself nullified, and then points out that whoever Dot is, the security droids are interested in her, thanks to the lack of barcode, something that everyone else has. She then asks where Bob is, getting the answer of him living with Old Man Fong, before Enzo throws her out of the diner, threatening her to stay off his turf. She eventually finds Fong, who has become little more than an insane homeless man, ranting and raving of just about everything. He brings out Bob, which turns out to be nothing more than a null in a cage. This makes Dot cry out in denial, stating how she didn't even try to win the game and wished for another chance. This prompts Fong to return to his normal self, proclaiming one of the most profound bits of wisdom he has in the show.
Chance has nothing to do with it, child. The future is not determined by a throw of the dice. It is determined by the conscious decisions of you and me.
After this, though, he reverts back to his insane self, running off when security appears to apprehend Dot. Eventually, she gets back in the corner with virals approaching her, Cyrus appearing on a vid screen, telling Dot that they are friends, before laughing evilly. Unable to put up any resistance, a security droid grabs a hold of Dot, shaving her head and placing a barcode in its place. And this is where the dream sequence ends. Now with her second chance, Dot does her best to defeat the user, using her intelligence and wit to earn a come-from-behind victory, ending the game. Dot then asks what Fong did to her, and the old sprite reveals that he used a reality distortion engine on her, believing that it would be the only way to snap the woman back to her normal self. A side effect of the engine is the visions we've been seeing this entire time. After deciding he's not wanting to find out what's going on with Dot or why Fong is there, and who can blame him, Bob asks if there's still time to save the binomes from being converted by Megabyte. It's pointed out that the sector is still under guard, and that's when Dot remembers that she encrypts every file on her organizer, realizing that the virus has yet to break the code. Rescuing some of the leaders from the sector for backup, in which it's revealed that the binomes don't blame Dot for what happened to the PIDs, our heroes are able to hack into Megabyte's computers, retrieving the files before he's able to download them into his converter. Dot then pulls the same trick Megabyte did, using a vid window to talk to the entire sector, saying that their fight for dominance is over and pegging Cyrus as the one who helped her retrieve the IDs. Of course, this pisses Megabyte off something fierce, telling Hack and Slash to take him to the extraction chamber, saying that he needs a new shoe-shine droid. The episode and Season 1 ends with Fong entering all of the IDs into the principal office, securing the safety of the binomes, and turning the sector into an energy park, with Bob asking Dot a single question.
So Dot, you like what you see?
Yes. Most definitely, yes.
The finale is one of the best episodes of the first season, though it's not without its problems. While I love the darker atmosphere and the fact that this is the only episode we've seen so far that shows that our heroes don't always win, the main problem actually stems mostly from Fong. Not only is the alternate timeline that's really a dream plot something that was tired and old even before Reboot was new, we've also got the added difficulty of the old sprite breaking the rules of the show. This episode is one of the only instances of a character being able to enter or leave a GameCube after it's landed, with it being implied in later episodes that it should be impossible to do so. While the argument could be made that as the keeper of the core, Fong might have some kind of device that might let him circumvent this rule, I find it highly unlikely as it's something that won't come up throughout the rest of the series. Overall, the first season of Reboot is fairly bare bones, but considering the difficulties that the creators were facing, it's easy to see why. Not only were they the first people ever to create a show that was completely made out of CGI, actually premiering a full year before Pixar came out with Toy Story, but the combination of constant interference with the censors and the overall cost of productions meant things had to stay simple. Instead, it's the characters that we come here for. With each of them having a distinct personality, it's actually fun to see how they play off of each other. Starting off with our resident guardian, Bob is actually somewhat of a new take on heroes at the time. Before Reboot hit the airwaves, most main characters in a cartoon usually were either newbies who didn't know anything, or veteran heroes who have been around the block once or twice. Bob, on the other hand, is clearly skilled and trained for his role as a guardian, but is also a newcomer to Mainframe and doesn't know all the rules or limitations that go along with it. There's also a difference in how he goes about saving the day as well, mostly doing it through the seat of his pants, using a combination of pure luck and his skills to overcome his enemies instead of planning. Some of his greatest victories come from him pulling something out of his ass in the last minute. Character-wise, Bob tends to carry some of the more typical tropes of a heroic male lead, such as being a bit overconfident in his abilities from time to time, as well as being reluctant to receive help, be it fighting off Megabyte or fixing his car. Otherwise, our hero is actually a bit more of an average Joe, the kind of guy who doesn't let his training or powers get in the way of spending time with his friends or living the casual life. Dot, like Bob, was actually very much a break from the norm for female lead characters. Whereas most before her tended to either be damsels in distress or in a mostly supporting role, Dot shows early on that she's more than willing to get her own hands dirty if it meant saving her friends in the city she lives in. Not only that, but it's revealed that Dot actually owns most of Mainframe, having business deals with nearly every sector she doesn't, making her one of the few female characters in nearly any franchise to have that level of wealth and power. This goes hand in hand with her personality, Dot being focused on mostly planning out every little aspect of her life, complete with charts, files, and just about anything else you can think of to help her do it. Despite this, Dot isn't cold nor out of touch with those around her, often being the source of some of the funnier jokes in the series. Her little brother Enzo, on the other hand, is very much a kid through and through. From what the original creators have stated, the only reason that the young sprite was even put in the show to begin with was because the distributors of Reboot said that there's no way to sell a show in the US otherwise. The producers were told to just put one in, some little Enzo, which eventually became his name. As far as kid characters go, though, Enzo doesn't actually have much in personality that doesn't often swing between excitable and impatient to brave and reckless. While he does fall into the same trap a lot of other child characters fall into, often being the one that needs saving or causing the problems of the day himself, we do see an honest and kind-hearted boy and all that, working his best to stay up to the standards that Bob and Dot have set before him. Frisket is a dog. Well, I say that, but this being the world of animation, we're actually able to even give him a little bit of personality. While he's really more there to give Enzo some way to actually contribute to the fight of the day, since there's actually not much a little kid can do otherwise, Frisket is shown to be very intelligent and even a very caring animal. He'll do just about anything for Enzo, and while he doesn't trust or even like Bob in the slightest, he's more than willing to work with the Guardian when it comes to saving the day. For the most part, though, he tends to be used for gags more than anything serious. When it comes to our villains, Megabyte is perhaps one of the most enjoyable characters of the entire series. While clearly a virus designed to do nothing more than to infect and control everything he can possibly get his hands on, Megabyte actually remains remarkably intelligent, cultured, and actually even willing to do things peacefully. So long as he gets his way, as we see in the very first episode when he talks to Bob about getting to the supercomputer before actually getting violent. Part of what makes him such an impactful villain to me, though, was his voice, a strong English baritone done by the late, great Tony J. It's just impossible for me to hear that voice in anything else without thinking of the virus, even when he's in the role of Judge Frollo from Hunchback of Notre Dame. That said, Megabyte also had a real Lord Zed complex going on, relying almost entirely on his henchmen to do everything for him, and only lifting a finger when Bob or the others made a fool out of Hack and Slash for the umpteenth time. This would often lead to his defeat, with the heroes being able to gain enough strength to gain the upper hand and turn the fight over into their favor. On the other side of things, we've got Hexadecimal. Whereas Megabyte was suave, strong, and intelligent, the Queen of Chaos lived up to her name by having powers that were unseen anywhere else in the series, as well as being completely and totally off her nutter. Tied to her mask that showed her personality at the time, Hex could go from being polite and sweet at one moment to screaming like a banshee in the next. No one, not even Megabyte, could tell what she was thinking at any one time. It's only by the virtue of her enjoying the chaos that Bob and the others brought that they didn't end up fighting her a little bit more often. Well, that, and she had a huge thing for Bob, but we'll get onto that a little bit more into the future. Fong is an interesting character as far as the first season of Reboot is concerned. Appearing just often enough and long enough to prevent him from being a supporting character like Cecil or Mike the TV, there's actually still very little to him. He mostly takes the role of the wise old mentor for the rest of the cast, there to act as either exposition or to give out some tool to help with the problem of the day. While he does get in a good few jokes here and there, we really don't come to care about him or think about him that much. He's just kinda there to be helpful, and we're supposed to appreciate him as such. Season 1 of Reboot was a show that had a lot of firsts when it came to children's TV, from its CGI animation to its concept to even how it portrayed its characters. And while its largely episodic nature hurt it a bit, especially when it was going up against the likes of Spider-Man the Animated Series and Gargoyles, the appeal of a world unlike anything else at the time is what drew most fans in, with most staying to see just what kind of things this computer world would throw at them next. We will learn just how crazy things get once we moved onwards into Season 2.
Don't touch that dial! You're tuned to the commercial channel! All commercials, all the time!
Ah!